when I first arrived here on Saturday, I found out from Solomon that Ethiopia is 30% Muslim. So I had not realized that you had nearly that many Muslims here. So what we will do next is to talk about the rise of Islam and the relation between Islam and East African Christianity. So some of this may be helpful for thinking about why the situation in Ethiopia was different from Nubia and Egypt with respect to Islam. But some will also be helpful, hopefully be helpful just because you have a lot of interaction with Muslims. So let's talk about the rise of Islam. Does everybody recognize this? This is the Kaaba in Mecca, which is a black structure, almost a cube, that seems to date from very, very ancient times. According to Muslim tradition, this was a pagan shrine prior to the rise of Islam. Nobody knows how far back it goes, but it was alleged to have 365 idols inside, one for every day of the year. So this was a very, very major center of pagan worship in Islam, in Arabia in the 6th century. So let's talk about the situation in Arabia in the late 6th century, because these were your neighbors. Remember that Axum extended on both sides of the Red Sea for a while. And in Arabia, and especially in South Arabia, you had a lot of both Jews and Christians, as well as the pagans who were in South Arabia in the 6th century. The Jewish Himyarite kings were very, very powerful. It was a very advanced civilization in the 6th century. There were also at least 3 different kinds of Christians there, not including Chalcedonians. So there were Oriental Orthodox present in Arabia. The Church of the East was present in Arabia. And there also seems to have been a small group called the Caliridians. There is a Greek heresy hunter named Epiphanius who lived in the 4th century, who describes a group in Arabia called the Caliridians, who believed that the Trinity consisted of Father, Virgin Mary, and Son, and believed that the Son was produced by sexual relations between God and the Virgin Mary. And so we don't have any other attestation that such a group existed. But if Epiphanius is right, and there was a group called the Caliridians that believed that, that would explain where Muhammad got his misunderstanding of the Trinity from. Because that's exactly what Muhammad thought about the Trinity. And most Muslims today still, part of the reason they're so averse to the idea of the Trinity is they believe that it involves that God had sexual relations with Mary or with somebody in order to have a physical son. So, 3 groups of Christians in Arabia: the Church of the East, the Oriental Orthodox, and the Caliridians. From 520 to 570, there was violent conflict between the Jewish Himyarites, the Christians, and pagans. There was a Christian king by the name of Abraha, who established a pretty substantial kingdom in what is today Yemen, in Sabia at the time. And he built a major cathedral in Sana'a. And the pagans tore it down before it could ever be consecrated. So no services were ever held in this cathedral. The pagans tore it down. Abraha swore that in response, he would go to Mecca and destroy the Kaaba, which would have been an absolute disaster for Christians and Jews probably in Arabia. So Abraha amassed an army and he marched on Mecca traditionally in the year 570. And a very small army of pagan Arabians somehow managed to defeat the larger Christian army and preserve the Kaaba from destruction. That's referred to by Muslims as the Battle of the Elephant, and it is regarded as being miraculous. It's described in the Quran, And it took place in the year that Muhammad was born. So Muhammad grew up hearing these stories of the way the Arabs had successfully defeated the Christians when they tried to destroy the Kaaba. So there's a huge amount of conflict between the Jews, the Christians, and the pagans in Arabia as Muhammad is born traditionally in the year 570. And he grows up with all of this religious conflict. Muhammad's major idea throughout his life is that there should only be one religion in Arabia. And part of that is because of all the conflict that he saw growing up between the different groups of Christians, Jews, pagans. His last words when he died in 632 were supposedly, "There will not be two religions in Arabia." Okay? So, in the year 610, when he's about 40 years old, Muhammad begins to receive revelations that allegedly come from the angel Gabriel. So these begin as he is meditating out away from town, up in the mountains, near Mecca, in the month of Ramadan, which is the first month of the Arab calendar, and he hears a voice that claims to be that of Gabriel telling him to recite. And then Gabriel simply recites to him what he is supposed to hear and write down. And that revelation of the Quran is believed to be a recitation of an eternal Quran that exists in heaven or in paradise. So there's a book up there, an eternal book up there, the real Quran. Gabriel reads it to Muhammad, who writes it down. Arabs believed that Muhammad was illiterate, and so his ability to write down the Quran was a miracle. And they also believe, this is probably true, that the Quran is in beautiful Arabic, which is also attributed to a miracle because it was written down by somebody who was illiterate. It's probably not true that Muhammad was illiterate. When he calls himself illiterate, that probably means unscriptured, meaning that he had no scriptures in his language the way the Greeks and the Hebrews did. And Gabriel is rectifying that problem by giving him scriptures in Arabic. But the Muslim belief is that Muhammad was illiterate. If you look at the Quran, the chapters, which are called surahs of the Quran, are organized from longest to shortest. Has anybody ever read it? Has anybody read the Quran? Okay. It's arranged from longest to shortest. But if you put the chapters in chronological order, which is not difficult to do, we are relatively confident about the stages of Muhammad's life and when the various surahs were written. So it's not difficult to put it in chronological order. If you do put it in chronological order, what you find is that Muhammad goes from an early henotheism to an inclusive monotheism to an exclusive monotheism. Now, what do I mean by that? Henotheism is the idea, I will worship only one God, even though there may be other gods out there. There could be multiple gods, but I'm not going to worship them all. I'm only going to worship one of them. That's henotheism. An inclusive monotheism, in this case, means there's one God, and that God is the same as the God of Jews and Christians. And then an exclusive monotheism is a monotheism in which he says there's one God, and that God is not the same as the God of Jews and Christians. So if you look at Muhammad's career as reflected in the Quran, he moves from being a polytheist to being a henotheist in the early years of his ministry, to being an inclusive monotheist, to being an exclusive monotheist, all in the space of 22 years, from 610 until his death in 632. In the year 622, Muhammad and his followers flee from Mecca to Medina, where they are able much more easily to gain control of the city and to develop the Muslim community. And from then on, they grow the community primarily by raiding. So let me talk about this for just a minute. A staple of the Arab economy was raiding. And there was a lot of advantage to be had by being a military tribe, and Muhammad was from a military tribe. So they had some agriculture in the south. They were able to raise cattle and sheep, goats in the desert, and there was trade. And the trade was all at the mercy of the military tribes, who could, take over a trade caravan anytime they wanted to, do whatever they wanted. And so Muhammad and his tribe and the growing group of Muslims would gain goods, money, whatever, by raiding other tribes. They would also gain adherents that way, as some of those other tribes would just join them rather than being continually raided. So to Christians, this looks pretty bad. This looks like not a very good way to gain converts, not a very good way to make money. But it was absolutely acceptable in the society in Arabia. And another thing that Christians need to recognize is that we are very, very concerned that when somebody professes Christ, he means it. We're concerned about the inner state of people's souls. So we want conversions to be genuine, not just nominal. That's extremely important to us. That is of relatively little importance to Muhammad and of relatively little importance to anybody in later Islam either. Islam is a political movement. It's about increasing the sphere in which Allah is named and his laws are followed. Whether a person means it when he says there's no God except Allah is almost irrelevant to Islam. So it's not a movement of personal faith. It's a movement primarily that is political. And so Muhammad was using political and military tactics to gain the allegiance of more and more tribes around Medina and around Mecca. In the year 632, not long before he dies, he triumphantly returns to Mecca, cleanses the Kaaba of all the pagan idols, supposedly 365 of them, and then unifies that part of Arabia around the worship of Allah alone. Okay? So everybody see what's going on here with the life of Muhammad. At the time that Muhammad dies in 632, most of the Arabian tribes have professed allegiance to Allah. Now, again, did they mean it? Probably not. It was probably a way of keeping from being raided and a way of maintaining their economic viability. But that's not the point. The point is that they were professing allegiance to Allah. Okay? Questions about this? By the way, I should ask, how much do you know about the early history of Islam and the relation between Islam and Christianity? I should have asked that first. Is this familiar? Is what I'm saying familiar? Okay, to some of you? Okay. All right. Now, one of the most important things to recognize about Islam is that one of Muhammad's rules was you cannot raid another tribe if they are Muslim. You can only raid infidel tribes. And that creates a problem because by the time Muhammad died, they controlled all of Arabia. So that meant necessarily that they had to go beyond Arabia and raid other tribes because raiding was central to their way of doing business. It was central to their economic prosperity. So they had to expand, in their mind, they had to expand outside of Arabia as soon as they controlled all of Arabia. So let's go from Muhammad then to the rise of Islam. Very shortly after Muhammad's death, there began to be tension between different factions in Islam. The Shia faction of Islam believes that the caliphate or the Muslim community should be ruled hereditarily. So descendants of Muhammad should rule. The Sunni Islam believes that the rule is not hereditary. Okay? In Ethiopia, you have primarily Sunni Islam, I assume. Is that right? Exclusively Sunni Islam.
You have Shia, but very small.
Okay. Okay. Sunni is about 85 or 90% of the world's Muslims. Shia is 10 or 15%, and most of those are in Persia. So mostly Sunni Islam here. Okay? After Muhammad dies, the Arabs very quickly defeat both the Byzantines and the Sassanids, that is to say the Romans and the Persians in Syria in the year 636. So Damascus falls in the year 636. Jerusalem is taken in the year 638. Seleucia-Ctesiphon, which is the capital of Persia, falls in 637, and all of Persia by 651. So within 2 decades of Muhammad's death, the Arabs have controlled the eastern portions of the Roman Empire and all of the Persian Empire. A major part of the reason why they were able to do that was that Rome and Persia were constantly fighting each other, and they were constantly on guard against each other. Along the Euphrates River, the border between them, they were always watching. There were always hostilities. Nobody was watching the Arabian desert to the south. Nothing had ever come out of that desert in history previously. So nobody was expecting an army to come out of the Arabian desert. So both Rome and Persia were taken completely by surprise and were conquered. Not the whole Roman Empire, but the eastern portion of it and all of the Persian Empire. So as the Muslims conquered this territory, in most cases, they were not concerned about the conversion of people to Islam. They wanted all Arabs to be Muslim. People from other tribes, other nations, it didn't make any difference to them whether they became Muslim or not. So people, Jews, Christians, Persians, Byzantines, those people could all maintain their identities if they wanted to. But if they did not convert to Islam, they had to submit to extra taxation and very second-class status in society. But surprisingly, a lot of people willingly allowed the Muslims to come in. They welcomed them. And the main reason for that is that both Persia and Rome were very cruel masters. And people thought the Arabs couldn't possibly be worse. So they allowed the Arabs to come in, and in many cases, Christians and Jews welcomed the Arabs. Okay? All right, let's turn our attention to the Arabs and Africa then. The Arabs along the Nile. In 639, just after they had conquered both the Eastern Roman capital and the Persian capital in the previous couple of years, the Arabs attacked Heliopolis in Upper Egypt in 639, and they took it. Byzantium was either unable or unwilling to provide military support to the Egyptians, and so the Arabs were able to take Alexandria in 641. Shortly after that, they invaded the Nubian capital of Dongola. The first time they were repulsed because of the skill of the Nubian archers, and the second time led to the Baqt. Have you ever heard of the Baqt? Have you heard of that agreement? Okay, the Baqt was an agreement between the Nubians and the Arabs that said basically this: neither side will invade the other side. Each side is allowed to pass safely through the other's lands. and Nubia would supply the Arabs in Egypt with 360 slaves every year in exchange for wheat, barley, and wine. So this is, in one sense, a trade agreement, a non-hostility agreement, but it's very, very much in favor of the Arabs, not in favor of the Nubians. So the Nubians were able to maintain some degree of independence from the Arabs rather than being taken over completely in exchange for having to pay a lot of tribute, not only goods, but also people, sending slaves to the Arabs. As far as I know, this is the beginning of what could be called the slave trade within Africa, as the Nubians were forced to send slaves every year to the Arabs. And as I think all of you know, as almost nobody knows in America, a great deal of the slavery in Africa was the enslavement of non-Muslims by Muslims. That's not news to you, but it's something that not very many people in the West know. Okay? How about Ethiopia? What happened with Ethiopia in this case? By 646, the Arabs controlled both sides of the Red Sea. And so Axum was reduced to the highlands around Lake Tana. This was the time when Axum, or Ethiopia, began to be called Habasa by the Arabs, which began to be Europeanized as Abyssinia. And up until, I think, very, very recently, this region has been called Abyssinia by Europeans. One of the most striking things about the Arab invasions is that they never invaded the highlands of Ethiopia. They invaded all the regions around, both sides of the Red Sea. As I'll say in just a minute, they went all the way across North Africa, crossed into Spain. They went halfway across Asia, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, but they never invaded the highlands of Ethiopia. And so one of the questions that is worth asking is, why? Why did they not invade Axum? Why did they not invade the highlands? Do you have any traditions with respect to that question in Ethiopia? Have you been told anything about why they didn't invade? It was not because you fought them off. They didn't invade. Has anybody heard anything? So it is quite possible that this is the reason they didn't invade the highlands of Ethiopia. During Muhammad's lifetime, he had sent about 100 people, including one of his daughters, his future son-in-law, and a number of other people across the Red Sea to Axum, and they were sheltered and given safety by the king of Axum at that time. So in return for that favor, that it may be the reason, in return for that favor, the Arabs did not invade Ethiopia. It's also possible that they just didn't like mountains, but they fought the Chinese in the foothills of the Himalayas a little bit later. We'll come back to that. So maybe that's not the main reason. Maybe the main reason is, in fact, that they were returning a kindness that was done to them by the people of Ethiopia during Muhammad's last lifetime. Okay, so let's talk about the rise of Islam. Let's take the story a little bit farther. By 661, the Muslims held all of the Middle East and Egypt. And at that point, they made Damascus the capital of their new empire, which was much more centrally located than Mecca or Medina was. In the 700s, they took all of Central Asia, threatened the Western Roman Empire, Byzantium, and China. And then their conquest finally came to an end in the year 751, as I'll talk about in just a minute. And they celebrated by building Baghdad on the Tigris River as a glorious capital in the year 762. And for 1,000 years, Baghdad, not 1,000 years, for 500 years, Baghdad was the largest and the richest city in the world, as well as being the center of the Muslim empire. So this map shows the movement of the Arabs So you notice they went to the edge of Nubia. They had the Baqt agreement with the Nubians. They didn't get very close to Ethiopia. The map's not quite accurate because they controlled the shore of the Red Sea on the African side as well. And they moved up into Asia farther and also across North Africa and into Spain as well. And the Muslim conquest culminated in 3 battles that I'd like to mention briefly, because these 3 battles redrew the map of the world, the religious and the political map of the world. The first was the siege of Constantinople in 717 and 718. Then the Battle of Tours in France in 732, and the Battle of Talas in what is today Kyrgyzstan in the Himalayas in 751. So here's where those 3 battles are. The greatest prize that the Muslims wanted was Constantinople, because Constantinople controlled trade routes across the world from east to west. It was also in a very easy position to defend because it was surrounded by water on 3 sides. And they tried for 100 years to take Constantinople and finally launched their greatest siege of Constantinople in 717 and 718. At that point, the Arab army came around from the west side of Constantinople by land, and the navy came by sea. But the Greeks were able to use what was called Greek fire, which is basically an early form of a hand grenade, to sink the Arab ships. So they were able to launch these incendiary devices onto the Arab ships. And they had a mixture of petroleum and other products in them that meant you couldn't put the fire out with water. So they burned down the ships of the Arab Navy. And the Arabs were, and still are, desert people. They're great in the heat. They're great in open plains, open desert. They're not good in forests. They're not good in the cold. And the Arab army basically froze to death in the winter of 718 in Constantinople. And so they were not able to take Constantinople, and the eastern portion of the Roman Empire, even though it was greatly reduced, was able to survive. From Spain, the Arabs also went up into France, where they were defeated by Charles Martel, who was Charlemagne's grandfather, in the Battle of Tours. And probably the main reason the Arabs lost that one was that they were not interested in forested land, and they were not interested in land that was far north. They liked hot weather, open plains, not forest, and not cold weather. In Central Asia, though, they were successful. And in 751, in the Battle of Talas, they defeated the Chinese, and the Chinese withdrew away from Central Asia, and for about 1,000 years, China maintained isolation as a result of it. So the Arabs, by 751, controlled all of the shaded regions of the map here. So the results: Muslim presence in Europe is limited to Spain. Western Europe is basically untouched by Islam and is poised to begin its rise to world prominence. So Europe, which has been very backward previously, is about to start increasing in significance for the world. The region from the western edge of Asia's borders to the western edge of Asia to the borders with China and India become Muslim. The Arabs become the world's greatest power. Ethiopia is relatively untouched, and China begins its decline into isolationism. So I spend a little bit of time on this because a lot of people, especially Westerners, think of a religious map of the world in which Europe is mostly Christian and Africa and Asia, or North Africa and Asia, are mostly Muslim. And we need to recognize it is through these conquests that the world begins to look like a lot of us think it looks. It was not like that previously. Africa and Asia were the center of Christianity previously. But except in Ethiopia and China, and a few other places, African and Asian Christianity had to live under the rule of Islam from this time forward. Okay? So, is this all familiar? Okay, good. So let's talk about the Coptic Church under Islam for a few minutes. So we're going to talk about the Copts and the Nubian seer, then we'll turn our attention back to Ethiopia again. So Coptic Church under Islam. One of the striking things about the African conquests by Islam is that West African Christianity, Latin North African Christianity in what is today Tunisia and Algeria, and a little bit in Morocco and Libya, basically died out. Whereas Coptic Christianity, Egyptian Christianity survived the rise of Islam. So there are various reasons for that, but probably the most significant one is that in the western part of Africa, Christianity was basically the religion of the Roman citizens living around Carthage. It was not the religion of the common people. There was no Bible translation that we know of into the Punic and Berber languages. Everything was in Latin. Most of the Christians were foreigners, Italians who lived in that area. And when they were threatened by Islam, most of those fled to Spain. So Christianity had never really taken hold with the people in Western North Africa. And that's part of the reason that it died out there, maybe the main reason. Whereas in Egypt, Christianity had taken much greater hold with the common people. It wasn't just the Greeks in Alexandria, but it was also the Copts throughout Egypt who were Christian. And so because of those indigenous roots, the church was able to survive in Egypt. The church was reduced to second-class status, but there was very little severe persecution until the time of the Crusades. Gradually, Christians began to transition to speaking and writing in Arabic. We find the first Christian writings in Arabic in around the year 780 or so, the latter part of the 8th century. And after that, more and more Christian literature is written in Arabic rather than in Coptic or Syriac or something like that. Until very recently, the Copts were a significant portion of the Egyptian population, around 20%. It's been mainly the result of the persecutions of the Muslim Brotherhood in the last couple of decades that many of the Copts have fled Egypt and have gone elsewhere. Okay? A little bit more about the Coptic Church under Islam. There have been long periods of relative peace. The Copts served in the governments of various different Islamic dynasties, the Ayyubids, the Fatimids, and the Mamluks. Around the year 1000 was the first really significant persecution of Copts in Egypt, with 3,000 churches being destroyed. And at that point, many, many more of the Copts turned to Islam than had been the case previously. Then there was a catastrophic decline in the Coptic population as a result of the 14th century persecutions during the plague. So let me talk about this for a minute. Did the plague reach Ethiopia in the 14th century? I have never heard of that. Okay. The plague began in Central Asia, and as a result of ordinary trade and commerce in the 1340s, it came to Egypt, Syria, other areas in the Middle East. It reached Europe in 1347, and its effects were devastating. In many places, half or over half of the populations of towns and cities died in the course of a couple of years because of the plague. In the 14th century, one of the striking things about the plague is that in every area, the plague was blamed on religious minorities. So people saw the plague as a judgment from God or their gods, depending on what their beliefs were. and they blamed the religious minorities. So in Europe, for example, the plague was always blamed on the Jews. It had nothing to do with the Jews. It was brought to Europe because of Italian merchants coming from Constantinople. But it was blamed on the Jews. And so the persecution of the Jews in Europe was significantly increased in the middle of the 14th century. But in Egypt, it was the other way around. The Arabs, the Muslims blamed the plague on the Christians, the religious minorities, and there was a significant persecution of Christians in the middle of the 14th century. The ones who didn't die because of the plague were killed in persecution. So this was a severe decline in Coptic Christianity in the middle of the 14th century. Okay? Let's talk about the Nubian church under Islam and about the death of the Nubian church. We've talked about the Baqt. The Baqt led to about 600 years of stability from 652 until the 1300s, 1200s. In the 700s and 800s, we have the unification of all three of the Nubian kingdoms into one kingdom. And during the Baqt period, the Nubian church flourished. This was the heyday of Nubian Christianity. You'll remember that I said earlier that Nubian society was transformed very quickly by Christianity and remained a very strongly Christian society for this entire period. There were surprisingly few monasteries. In most cases, in Ethiopia, in Egypt, in most areas, it was the monasteries that were fueling the spiritual growth of the country. Not so much in Nubia. Not so many monasteries, not as many monks, but a culture that was permeated by Christianity in a significant way. There are some accounts of attempts by the Nubians to evangelize tribes from Mali, what are today Mali, Burkina Faso, and Senegal. So there seem to have been some movements west in the southern part of the Sahara and in sub-Saharan Africa from Nubia. So this was a great period for the Nubian church. But that began to change in the 1100s and the 1200s. In 1172, the Ayyubid dynasty conquered the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt, and in 1260, the Mamluks took over Egypt. So there's a lot of unrest in Egypt in the 1100s and the 1200s. Nubia began to break up into feudal kingdoms. The Christian vision collapsed. And by 1323, as the Baqt came to an end, there was a new treaty with the Muslims, which basically involved Muslim ideology rather than Christian. By 1500, there was little Christian presence remaining. So Nubia is one of the few examples of a very strong Christian culture in a region, and the church died out there more or less altogether. Nubia by 1500 had died out. Latin North Africa, today's Algeria and Tunisia, is another example of an earlier dying out of a vibrant Christian culture. That has not happened often in history, but here are a couple of African examples where it did happen. Okay? Some possible reasons for the death of Nubian Christianity. First of all, as is often the case, it was very closely tied to the monarchy. And the problem with the close tie to the monarchy is that when that monarchy is overthrown, then what do you do? Another possible reason is isolation. As Egypt became more Muslim, Nubia was isolated, and that could have had something to do with it as well. Nubian Christians were isolated. And it could simply have been an inability to withstand political and social chaos. The people's Christian faith may not have been deep enough to survive all the chaos around them and all the pressure to align themselves with their new conquerors, the Muslims. So a Christian Nubia begins to yield to an almost exclusively Muslim Sudan, as it appears today. The northern and the central parts of Sudan, what is today Sudan now that they've partitioned it, was mainly Muslim in spite of a long history of Christianity. Okay? Questions about this? What do you think about the fact that two significant regions of Africa that had a major Christian presence, Latin North Africa and Nubia, both saw Christianity more or less wiped out and replaced by Islam? Does this enhance the need to distinguish Ethiopia from Africa? Or is it sobering? Is this something you've thought about before?
Can you repeat the question, please?
I'm sorry?
Would you mind repeating the question?
Okay. So thinking about the fact that two significant regions of Africa had a very strong Christian culture, Latin North Africa and Nubia, and in both cases, Christianity has died out almost completely. So, first question is just, have you thought about that before? Is that sobering? Are there lessons that we need to draw from that? Warnings that we need to take from them? Okay. Okay, good. Yes, it's certainly the case that if Christianity is too tied to the political situation, too tied to the rise of kingdoms, then it's going to be difficult for the faith to be embedded deeply enough in the people's souls for it to survive a change of government. If you have another kingdom coming in with a different religion, it's going to be all too easy for those people simply to convert to something else as a matter of convenience. And so, yes, we see that in Nubia, although very slowly. We see that in Constantinople, although very slowly. And we see that in other places as well. We also see that there are some places where the people's Christian identity and their sense of themselves as a kingdom is what enables them to ward off invaders or to survive or to be reborn, for the church to be reborn. And you see that kind of thing in some of the longest running Christian kingdoms. Ethiopia is one of those, and we're going to talk about Ethiopia some more in just a few minutes. But Georgia and Armenia are among those as well that have a Christian history tied to the nationality about the same length of time as Ethiopia. And it was that Christian identity in both of those cases that enabled them, sort of to outlast the Soviet regime and to reemerge as Christian kingdom. So this happens in a lot of different ways, and different things happen in different situations. And on the one hand, we want to see a people's identity tied to Christianity. But the danger of that is that that's going to lead to a nationalistic sort of identity that mistakes the political kingdom for the kingdom of God and for the church. But you see a lot of different things playing out, especially in this part of the world and in the Middle East. You have some Christian groups that have survived. They've been very small, very isolated in the midst of Muslim regimes in Syria, in Persia, in other places, and yet they have survived. In other cases, you have situations where they've survived a long time, but the Copts now, for example, are substantially giving up, and many of them are fleeing to other areas. So it's a sobering and a complicated, a very complicated kind of situation. Okay, good. Any other thoughts about this with respect to Nubia? Yes, Amani. Well, I don't doubt, you mean Westerners say this? Westerners criticize the East for this? Yes, but I don't see how you can say that the East is uncivilized compared to the West. Unless you want to say that Islamic influence itself is de-civilizing. The great civilizations of the world have been, ancient civilizations. Most of those arose in Africa and Asia. Not all. There were some in what is today Mexico and South America as well. But most of those emerged in Africa and Asia. And when Westerners look at the East and call it uncivilized, I think they're just talking about regions where Islam dominates. To some degree, yes. But Islam did succeed in taking over some of the great civilizations of the world. Persian civilization, Byzantine civilization. Those were, at the time, great civilizations. Again, not the West. Western Europe at this time was the uncivilized one. In Ireland, there weren't even any towns. It was entirely rural at the time that the Irish monks were evangelizing Europe. So is Islam, one of the things that Islam did as they took over these civilizations was to appropriate their wealth, their knowledge, their technical expertise, and things like that. The Arabs were great horsemen. Arabs, Mongols, Native Americans may have been the greatest horsemen in world history. They were great warriors on open plains. They were geniuses at leveraging the spoils of war to promote further conquest. They had very little skill in medicine or technology or architecture or art or accounting or anything like that. But what they did was they relied on the people they conquered for all of those things. And so Christians, Jews, and others were able to do very well for themselves in Muslim societies if they had some of the skills that the Muslims need. So the Arabs built their civilizations using the civilizational acumen and gifts of the people that they conquered, whereas they themselves mainly were military. And I suppose that even today that may account for the instability in so many areas where Islam has had dominance. If it's primarily a military mentality. And then the Turks were even more military than the Arabs were. And so as Turkish Islam began to take over Turkey and the Middle East, which was in the 11th century, you have even more instability in all of these areas. So you can look at that. You can look at that and call it uncivilized, but the lack of the uncivilized nature of it, the instability, seems to me to come primarily from the military nature of the Arabs and the Turks, rather than because the East in general is less civilized than the West. I don't think that's true. In fact, I think the opposite is probably true. Any other thoughts on this? Yes, Demetrius. Sure. There's not a lot of hard evidence, but they seem to have gone west with seeking to be evangelistic and missionary-minded, yes. It happened with the Ethiopian church, which wasn't more successful than the Nubian. We'll talk about that. The Ethiopian church, after this period, made some significant efforts to go farther south with the gospel. The Nubians to the west. None of those were successful. And that's one thing that we can think about. Why did the Protestant missions succeed so well in Africa, where the indigenous missions from Nubia and Ethiopia previously had not succeeded? I have no answer for that, but we can talk about that once we get to that. Is that typical of Oriental? Do you mean Oriental Orthodox churches? Is that what you're talking about specifically? The Nubians made some efforts. The Ethiopians made some efforts. Armenia None that I know of. Syria did some missions work in India and on the west coast of India. But the Oriental Orthodox do not seem to have had the kind of missionary vision that the Church of the East had, for example, when the Persian missionaries went to India and later to China and all over Central Asia. So no, I don't think there was as much missions vision among the Oriental Orthodox compared to other branches of the church. But some work by the Nubians, some by the Ethiopians. Okay? Good question. Okay? All right, let me say just a couple of words about Ethiopian Christian history in this time period, and then we'll stop and have some discussion, and then we'll move into later Ethiopian Christian history after that. In the middle of the 9th century, in 854, there was significant conflict between Nubia and Egypt. And if you look at this from the point of view of those two nations, this was just an interlude in the middle of the Baqt. The Baqt was very successful at keeping peace between Nubia and Egypt for a long period of time, with this one exception in the middle. But this one exception turned out to be fairly significant for Ethiopia. So let me mention it here. The conflict temporarily cut off communication between Egypt and Alexandria, which means that between Ethiopia and Alexandria, which means that the Ethiopians were no longer able to receive your abunas, your patriarchs, from Egypt. And so that left Ethiopian Christianity pretty much completely independent for several hundred years. The contact with Alexandria would be restored, as I'm sure you know, a bit later. But there was this period, beginning in the 9th century, when Ethiopian Christianity was almost completely isolated. Very little contact with Egypt. The Coptic church in Egypt is struggling a bit under the Muslim regime in Egypt anyway. And so Ethiopia is going almost completely its own way. It was during this time that the Ethiopians attempted to evangelize and also to annex their southern neighbors. So this is a case where missions work and military conquest or political conquest were linked, but those were not successful. But the point here is that Ethiopia, from that time forward, has had an almost completely independent Christian history. Intermittent contact with Egypt, cut off for several hundred years here before being renewed. But Ethiopia has not been in contact, Ethiopian Orthodoxy has not been in contact with the rest of the Orthodox world or with the rest of the Christian world to any great degree for most of its history, which means that Ethiopia's Christian history, starting at about this time, is sort of like India's Christian history from the beginning, because the Thomas Christians in India had very little contact with the rest of the church for most of their history. And so the Thomas Christians have a lot of unique traditions that are not replicated elsewhere because of their independent history. Same thing with Ethiopia. The lack of contact with the rest of the church, coupled with the Jewish influence in both Ethiopia and India, means that both of them have a lot of Jewish traditions, and you're very well aware of them. We'll talk about them in just a little bit. So that isolation is a significant part of the story of Ethiopian Christianity. But I'd like to suggest that it may be interesting for some of you to learn about Indian Christianity as well, because it's a very similar kind of situation. An early church, an isolated church, and a church that later, part of it, allied with Oriental Orthodoxy. So the situation on the west coast of India, the Malabar coast of India, strikes me as being similar to the Ethiopian Christian situation historically in ways that really no other branch of the church has that kind of similarity. So just something to think about if you want to look into Indian Christianity as a parallel to that of Ethiopian Orthodox. Okay? Now, questions for us to think about. What if we take a few minutes before we get to the break, take a few minutes here and talk in groups about the questions that are up here now. How do typical Ethiopians view the fact that Ethiopia has had an independent Christian history, less disrupted by Islam than in most of Africa? So is that a part of the Ethiopian consciousness? Perhaps how does that affect relations with the many Muslims who are here in Ethiopia? Think about that question together. And then how do you as Protestants relate to this sense of Christian national pride? It is something to be suspicious of, maybe. Is it something to reject, to repudiate? Is it something that could be useful in your ministry? Okay, so let's talk about those questions for a few minutes. Let me say one more thing before we take the break in connection with this. The situation here versus other parts of Africa strikes me as being analogous to something that I've seen earlier in Christian history elsewhere. So let me mention this as well. In early Christian missions, when missionaries were going into a culture that was less primitive than theirs, less primitive than Roman culture, for example, they could overawe the people. They could impress the people with Roman civilization and Roman culture and be fairly critical of the pagan culture they were going into and be quite successful. And that strikes me as having some parallels to the way colonial missions had some success in other parts of Africa. But in early Christian missions, when Christians were going into a very advanced culture, like when the Persian missionaries went to China, you couldn't impress them, you couldn't overawe them. So you had to take a much more respectful attitude toward the culture around you. And that seems to me to be more like the situation in Ethiopia, as opposed to the situation in some of the other countries of Africa where colonial missions were more effective. And so, to think about that as it affects the attitude that you take to orthodoxy around you, maybe that would be helpful to recognize. So the Irish monks are to Northern European culture as the European colonists have been to some of the African cultures. And there was effectiveness there, whereas the Persians were to China as we are to Ethiopian culture, perhaps. Does that make sense?